State Senate 28th District. The Salton Sea, the northern tip of it, is in the 28th District, by the way. Most of it is in Ben Huesos District, but I would love to work with him. Go ahead, we're going to go, if you don't mind, I'll go through the presentation. It's not terribly lengthy, but if you could hold your questions to the end, that would be appreciated, because usually I get sidetracked and we'll never get through it. So it's one of those things. I'm also a professor and a dean at law school, and so when you get me talking, you bought it, you own it. What can I tell you? Okay, with that said, I put together a presentation called Greetings from the Salton Sea, Separating Fact from Fiction. Again, the Salton Sea is a very, very interesting story. It sort of rose to these dizzying heights. It sort of has now fallen to these dizzying lows. And it's quite an anomaly, and it's very difficult to actually really know what to do unless we go back and we look at the history of what really did happen. With that said, if you see me go like this, by the way, that's me. I don't have a remote control, so I brought my remote control tonight. That's my wife, Meg. And if or Pat, you're going to do it. Oh, even better. So if you can move to the next slide. One of the more interesting questions I always get is the Salton Sea a man-made body of water? And the answer is actually no, it is not. Now, it is actually true that what happened this time was in the early 1900s, as we'll see on the next slide. What happened is they were diverting water out of the Colorado River, and because they underestimated the amount of water that would be going through, it broke through the barriers, and strangely enough, water flows downhill. I think they might have figured that one out. It goes into what at the time was called the Salton Basin. Okay, but before the Salton Basin, it was actually and it's been basically a lake that goes dry. It's called the Dry Lake. And we know that over the last 2,000 years, we know there's at least been 5 different lakes. Interestingly enough, the last was called Lake Cahuilla, as you can see here. And as you can see, it is much bigger than the Salton Sea. It was basically 3 times as big. And I always find it really curious because India was underwater. I always wonder about that myself. But anyways, with that said, so it is not a man-made sea. It actually exists as a basin, and again, it has actually filled and dried up at least 5 times that we know of over the last 2,000 years. And we know that from sedimentary studies. Next, please. There again, the Salton Sea was created between 1905 and 1907. Again, the Colorado River breaks through these diversional canals. Again, they're sending water to the Imperial Valley. And it floods in for approximately, it was almost 2 years. The water kept flooding in. It didn't happen overnight. Finally, when we're all done, it was 376 square miles large, which makes it larger than Lake Tahoe and Mono Lake. It's actually a very, very big body of water. Originally, it was dubbed the mistake of a lake. This is what they called it in the papers and things of that nature. Finally, what stopped the water, by the way, is that all of the agencies and businesses that lived in the area, lived and worked in the area, actually went bankrupt because they were underground. The only actual enterprise or entity that could fix it was the railroads that owned a lot of land around there. And so what they did was, after almost 2 years, and before the Colorado River almost went dry, almost all of it got in, they had what was called the Great Train Car Rally. And basically what they did was, for 52 consecutive days, for 24 hours straight, rail cars came up to a certain part of the river and dumped gravel into it till it finally stopped running. But it took 52 days of 24-hour a day. And that's how they finally stopped it. And there's also these wonderful anecdotal stories about how they would throw big boulders in there and stuff like that. It's just, this is 1905. Next, please. Now, interestingly enough, if the lake was left to its own, it would have evaporated again. It would be evaporating naturally, which would be something that we would be dealing with today, but in a much more natural way. The problem is that in 1928, the federal government decided that it made a perfectly good runoff for all of the Imperial Valley, all the waters that go through the irrigation and things of this nature. Once again, physics, water runs downhill. Story of the lake itself. And so it comes down, and they decide to designate it as an waste and seepage water, wonderful title for it, where all the runoffs from the Imperial Valley will go into this, basically, to continue to fill the basin. And that was the big plan. Up until 1928, they had no other particular plan for it. They were actually already putting some hatcheries for fish in it before this time, because during World War I and later in World War II, a lot of the canneries were terrified of being attacked off the shores, and so they moved all the canneries inland, and one of them was the Salton Sea, interestingly enough. And so that's where our story ends. No. That's where it could have ended. However, what happened is a very interesting entrepreneurial guy named Gus Eilers decides that the Salton Sea would be a perfectly good place for a resort. And so he builds in 1927 the Salton Sea State Palm Beach Resort. He brings in basically speedboat racing, which at the time was very flash stuff. And so it became hugely popular. And so all of a sudden, all these very, very well-known persons of the time are coming to this area to either watch or participate in these boat races. And so all of a sudden now the Salton Sea, from being basically a seepage dump for water, now has cachet, or at least some cachet. And so there you can see some pictures, very famous cards from the early boat races. As you can see, they were very well attended, very popular, very hard to get a ticket to. 1947, another entrepreneurial fellow named Roy Hunter, he bought Lake Palm Beach, and basically he changed his name to Desert Beach and turned it not from speedboat racing, but to a yacht club, the remains of which are still actually in the sea. Actually, you can go see what's left from it. It's not in very good shape, although they did go for some restoration a couple years ago, but you actually can see what's left of it. And so this again attracts another group of people. This time it's sort of yacht enthusiasts and things of this nature. And again, the cachet of the sea is growing. Okay, no longer can it really be called just the irrigation dump for the Imperial Valley. Now it's actually a destination where all the stars of the day would go there to have whatever parties or whatever events that they would actually attend. One of the more famous persons was General George Patton. Loved going out to the Salton Sea. You always read about him going down and things like that. Next, please. And so, in fact, at the height of its popularity, the Salton Sea State Recreation attracted more people a year than Yosemite. This is an actual fact. At one time, I don't know if this is true, but there was anecdotal evidence that at one time there were 450,000 boats on the sea at one time. That's how popular it was. So, very, very popular place. It was often referred to as the French Riviera of California. And there's a postcard that on the back of it said the French Riviera of California, indeed. So now everybody is coming out to the sea. And so it's obtaining this mythical position in California history. In fact, and I always find this very funny, I always consider this the height of fame in at least California, is that the Salton Sea had its very own Hollywood horror feature film. It was called The Monster That Challenged the World. It was a 1957 science fiction monster movie about an army of giant mollusks that emerged from the Salton Sea. And next, there's the heading. There you go. And if you were to see the movie, you'd see the Salton Sea is where these mollusk creatures are coming out of. Now, switching gears though, so now at the late 50s is probably the time when the Salton Sea was its most popular. It started to recede somewhat in the 60s, and by the 70s was flat as a pancake. We'll see why in a minute. But the problem is the other problem, if we can switch gears here, is another misconception is that the Salton Sea has no particular environmental impact on the region. This is not true. Okay, this is absolutely not true. As a matter of fact, when the Salton Sea first filled, it brought freshwater fish with it. And so again, this is not a man-made lake. This is not some kind of phenomenon that could not have happened there, except for man's intervention. It just so happens that's how it filled. If it rained enough, it would have filled again. So that's not the problem. However, as the salinity increased through the years, the freshwater fish disappeared. Well, again, I don't know who was the entrepreneurial person, but they actually carted in saltwater fish. Someone actually said one day, "You think saltwater fish could live there?" And they said, "I don't know, let's find out." A bunch of guys started a hatchery. And sure enough, it caught on. And so there were actually, at one time, there were several, about 100 species, I think, totally speaking. But today, there's at least 4 that we know of that are still there: tilapia, gulf croaker, corvina, and sargo. Although there is anecdotal evidence that perhaps the tilapia is the one that is the only fish left that has any significant numbers. So again, problematic because the salinity is going up way too high right now. Perhaps is more important or interesting is the birds have always liked the Salton Sea. You know, it's there, they find it convenient, happens to be a very logical place for them to stop in all sorts of migratory patterns. Interestingly enough though, what makes the Salton Sea so unique is there are basically only 900 bird species that would even fly anywhere near California. And 400 of them stop at the Salton Sea. So almost half of all the known migratory birds that we know of stop at the Salton Sea. So it has its own kind of environmental, it's already become an environment and an ecosystem in and of itself. So again, it's very, these are not events that we made happen. Okay, we didn't tell the birds to go there. In fact, it is the number 2 destination for migratory birds. The first stop is in the Gulf of Mexico, by the way, that's even bigger, just so you know, but it is number 2. That would be a Butler's bird that you can still see to this day. They're called Butler's birds because they're black and white. Apparently someone thought they looked like butlers. But again, there's still many species that do stop at the Salton Sea. Next, please. And that's where the story ends. Nope. Sorry. That would have been a good ending place too. Unfortunately, there's a huge problem, well, several problems with the Salton Sea. The biggest problem is that it's a sea. Okay, and a sea, it's actually really not a sea, it's a lake if you really look it up. But either way you look at it, nothing goes out of it, everything goes in. And so this is a big problem because what happens is the only way that water can escape is through evaporation. So everything that goes in stays in. And so what happened is in the 70s, because everything that goes in stays in, and because again of unusual weather patterns and things that you couldn't really anticipate, in the late 70s there were 2 massive floods that basically wiped out the entire Salton Sea. Almost every business was abandoned, almost every home that was actually within, the shoreline was abandoned as well. And so what you see today is the remains of these, mostly they were these houses and buildings that were being built in the 70s. They had sort of gone on to a second kind of restoration project where they were going to build more and more around the area. And then these 2 floods came and everything just got washed out. And so that's what you see to this day, nothing's ever been done. So all those buildings have been sitting there for 40 years. With basically no one tending them at all. Again, very big problem there. Okay, there you can see, you can just go through the next 4. That's what it looked like in the 70s. That's a mobile home that was entirely underwater. Next, please. There's what remains of it. That was actually a building. It's still there. You can go, all these 4 pictures, they're still there. If you want to go see them, I actually went out and saw them. Actually there right now. Okay, one more. Oh, only 3. Sorry about that. And so that's where the sea sits today. Now, the other problem is that another fact or fiction here is that a little salt never hurt anyone. Well, that might be true. But the fact is that the water in the Salton Sea right now is 30% saltier than the Pacific Ocean. Anecdotal evidence tells us it might be 40, and anecdotal evidence tells us it might be 50 since the last time they actually really measured it. So imagine that. The thing is basically half salt. Nice, you probably float in the back. That's why the boats go across it so fast, by the way. But again, and it continues to go by 1% annually because again, nothing goes out. Everything gets stuck in there. So it's a big problem. You have more salinity, you have nothing going out. That means that basically what happens is that the oxygen supply that's within the lake starts to get taken up by things like algae. It gets started taken up by whatever organism and microorganisms are there. And so basically the short version of why you see, I'll see it in a second, but the short version of why the fish are dying is because they don't have any oxygen. They're actually suffocating. And the other reason why the birds are dying is so they have no fish to eat. That's the short version of what's going on right now. Next, please. Okay, again, you can see that every year about 1.1 million acre-feet of water disappears. That's quite bad. So again, and as we'll see in a second, it's not getting any better. In fact, it's getting worse, as we'll see in a second, and I'll show you why. Next, please. In 1986, in fact, this is not, this is 1986, so we're talking almost 30 years ago. California first announced that evidence should restrict the consumption of fish caught in the Salton Sea for fear of toxicity lessons. Again, what's in there is kind of a mixture of still some runoff water mixed with, of course, pesticides, which is another problem which compounds the issue. Okay, so again, in 1986, California first decides that the fish should not be eaten in any great amounts. You could still have some, but don't make it a staple of your diet, is basically what they said. Next, please. Bird deaths at the Salton Sea, blamed on the toxic algae. If you ever go down there, you'll see there's nothing but algae in the water. The algae itself isn't really dangerous. You could probably eat it. Maybe have some toxins in it, but it wouldn't kill you. Problem is that algae take up a lot of oxygen. Right. And so basically you have the situation where, you know, you have all these birds that mysteriously have died over the years. There's been several events of these. And what they're thinking is that just some point, the birds who will eat the algae, by the way, they become too toxic. I don't think they'd hurt us, but the birds can't eat it, they die. So that's what they think it is right now. They're not sure about that either. Next, please. Very importantly, that all may be true, but there are no threats to humans. This is not true. Okay, there is a great threat to human persons within the environment there. The reason we know this, first of all, is because even through history, dry lake beds are dangerous. Okay, that's the way it is. That's never changed. How dangerous they are? Interesting question. Why do you think when the Mormons went to Salt Lake City, to start Salt Lake City, they looked for the most abandoned, barren place that they could get away from, because it was actually, at the time they left, it was actually legal to murder a Mormon in Missouri. So they took off. They went to the most desolate, abandoned place that they could find, which happened to be next to a salt lake. Shocking, because the Native Americans knew that there were a lot of problems that came from the salt lake. And to this day, there are still measurable health impacts from the Great Salt Sea on Salt Lake City. To this day, they can still measure that asthma and all other respiratory diseases go up in the first half of the year. They know that, they can measure that. The reason we should be worried about that is because the best example we have is a place called Owens Valley Lake. Anyone ever heard of that? Yeah. Indeed. And so what happened was Los Angeles decided they needed more water. They diverted the water away from Owens Lake. Basically, when they drained the lake, or the river, what was left down there, basically what happens is it's a mixture of salt, toxins, all sorts of things. It becomes what's called a particulate. That's the word for it. And it attaches itself to other types of dust. And so when the dust storm comes up, you get particulates from lake beds, which are full of salt and toxins. And so I can tell you right now that, and basically, if you look at the Owens Lake Valley right now, it's a wasteland. The storms are so bad there that to date, and they only did this in the 90s, I believe. It was in the 1990s they did this. They have already spent $400 million trying to stop the effects of the dust storm, and they're nowhere near stopping it. So we know this. This is within the last 20 years. And again, this is not new. This is nature. Every time you take a lake bed, that's what happens. It's just what happens. You can't avoid it. Next, please. Again, you can kind of read about this. Again, very interesting. The Cahill report was done in 1996. It's very definitive. If you can't sleep, please try to read it. It's really interesting. But here you go. This is the things that happen. This is documented. This is not them making it up. This is documented from what's happening in the Owens Valley and areas before that. Just so we're clear on the concept, the Salton Sea is 4 times as large as the Owens Lake bed. So we have no idea what 4 times the Owens Lake bed looks like. We don't. If anyone out there tells you they do, they're lying. They don't know. Next, please. That's what Owens Valley looks like today. Common dust storm. It's actually quite toxic. Children have very high elevated rates of childhood asthma. First it hits children, then it hits older adults, and then it hits the general population. Asthma and respiratory diseases go up, period. Next, please. Another thing I find very interesting, now that we kind of know how we got here, what the problem is that a lot of persons still say, well, what's the federal government doing about it? The answer is nothing. They're not responsible for it. It's not their job. Interestingly enough, we know that Barbara Boxer just had a big hearing about it, and Robert Ruiz was there, the guy for the seat. And they actually got the federal government's attention. That's true. And so they did actually put some funds into it. I think it was about $2 or $3 million. But what do you think they did with it? Studies. 2 studies. The Salton Sea has been so studied. This is almost unbelievable. As we'll see in a second, there's at least 20 plans that have been made. The first one was in the 1960s, which basically one plan is better than another, whatever else have you. Nobody really knows which one, but there's 20 complete plans right now. I can tell you something to do with the Salton Sea, so that's not the problem. On top of which, UC Redlands has a bank. They've been studying the Salton Sea for 15 years. There's 15 years of absolute, data and statistics on what's going on there. So we already have a lot of the background data. There's no reason to go and revisit the background data. It's being followed for 15 years. It's a fellow named Tim Krantz, Dr. Krantz, if you want to look up at UC Redlands. Next, please. Who is responsible? It's called basically the authority for the Salton Sea, or whatever you want to call it. It's basically a body. It's a long story how we got here too, but it's a body that's made up of many smaller bodies, mostly local, who have an interest in seeing the Salton Sea be repaired. Those are the persons that are back in charge right now, and those are the persons that are right now, as we speak, making the decisions for the Salton Sea. Obviously, they still have to ask California for money. They still do go to the federal government for money. But this is actually the body that does make the decisions. This is the body that Manny Perez has been working with. Because that's the body. He has a good stake in this as well. Next, please. So, Baxter Fishing, please tell me they have a plan. They do. In fact, again, there's over 20 plans that are already complete. They're either complete or almost complete, but they're pretty much workable. Right now, as we speak, there's really two plans that people like to talk about. There's a 2006 plan and a 2007 plan. This is the cover of the 2007 plan. It's the most latest one. That's the one they're discussing in Washington right now. This is the one that looks like it might be a go. For my money, I think it's the most interesting one. The reason for that being is because, I'll give you the short version, is what it does is it takes the Salton Sea, it shrinks it to about 1/5 its size. What's left on one side of it, so it breaks it into like a figure 8. So you have one side that's still going to have water. They're going to clean the sea, make it into brine water, have desalinization, the whole thing. Then they're actually going to fence off part of it as an estuary for birds. It's a really fascinating plant. The other side, geothermal plant. Just so happens that one of the second largest geothermal plant field known to man is under the Salton Sea. How about that? Fascinating. Why don't we do it? The funny part is, how many of you know we actually have geothermal plants out there? How many of you know they're really small and don't do much? And yet here's the second biggest known geothermal field or bed, whatever you want to call it, in the world that we know of, and maybe others really know of this. So that's the plan that I personally like. I think it's very forward-looking. Now here's the part they also never seem to tell you at all, is what they always talk about is that the price is about $8.9 to $9 billion. Strangely enough, the very first plan that was made was in about 1964 or 65. If they had implemented it then, it was $325 million. But they didn't do it. They just didn't think it was important enough. And so things dragged. One day when we have more time, I'll tell you about how we wouldn't be having this problem except Sonny died. That's when it all hit the skids. Actually, he was a huge supporter of the Salton Sea. Yeah. But here's the deal, let me tell you, $9 billion does sound like a lot of money. But when's the last time anybody told you that that is spread over 75 years? This includes monitoring and ongoing changes and ongoing adjustments and all sorts of things. The actual $9 billion tag is not met until year 75. So you do the math. So, with that in mind, and here's some of the ways that they're actually going to raise monies for the Salton Sea, by the way. There's many others as well, but these are the highlights of the 2007 plan. How they intend to raise money. They probably also want federal fees as well, which look like it might be coming. And they also do want the participation of the Federal Army Corps of Engineers, which we think they can get as well. So that's also important. That will cut the price as well. Next, please. Time is running out. That's a fact. And I'll tell you why. Because guess where all the water's going now? Cities, the big cities, we have some water still coming in. The sea was stable. San Diego decided they needed the water. They cut it off in 2013. It's moving away, moving away, moving away. There's no more water coming into the Salton Sea. Let me repeat that again. There's no more water coming into the Salton Sea. It's only evaporating. The Salton Sea is a very shallow sea. It's not deep, it's very wide, but it's shallow. That means that the seabed will be exposed in a short amount of time. Right now, our best estimates is it will be as early as 2017. The seabed will be exposed. It is a toxic mess of salt and pesticides. It will go airborne. It will get mixed into the dust storms in the area, and we do not know how far that will carry. Anyone that tells you they know, they do not know. That's one of the things they really don't know yet, because this is a, I hate to use the words, and it could be nothing, who knows, but it could be a potential catastrophe, the size that we've never seen. So, 9 billion is over 75 years. After that 9 billion for 75 years, we would have the Salton seabed, recreation, we'd have businesses all going around, we'd have a geothermal plant, we would avoid a major potential health hazard. To me, that's all win-win. It makes no sense at all. If you really want to talk about, making jobs, a lot of jobs right there, I'll tell you that. With that said, we must act now. That's the bottom line. That's the last fact I have for you. We must act now. The seabed will be exposed as early as 2017. Most likely. Well, I'll tell you what you should do. I have a very simple solution. After everything Matt told you, and this is, should I be in Sacramento at the time? Stop talking about it and start doing it. Stop with the plans, stop with the studies. We already have all the information we're ever going to need. We don't need to run the risk when the actual economic and cultural rewards and environmental rewards are clear that we should do this. Therefore, my plan is I'm going to buy a shovel. And I'm going to go out there and I'm going to put it in the dirt and I'm going to dig the first one and say, let's go. You with me? All right. Well, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
How does the density of salinization compare with the Great Salt Lake?
Oh, I honestly don't know the exact answer to that, but I suspect that it is saltier now. And the thing is, it's getting to a point where, what are we going to do? I mean, I know the Salt Lake's not more than 50%. Oh, I'm sorry. I know that the Salt Lake's not more than 50%, and yet there is anecdotal evidence that we're either there or going there. So what happens when it's 60%? What happens when it's 70%? What happens when it's 80%? Terrible. Nick, in the back?
Yeah, Phil, I just wanted to mention that already we're having particulate emissions coming from the lake bed in Imperial County that are causing problems. This is not just a thing of the future; it's already happening.
Yeah, Nick makes an excellent point. Again, I don't sit down on board meetings. I'm just taking a guess. But notice how they set up all of those. All of a sudden, they've got a whole big new row of machines on the side of the Salton Sea that are measuring the particulates in the air. All of a sudden, that's become a huge issue to them. They've got all these calibrating machines and things like that. They thought that was the first thing they should do, is put that in place. You've got to kind of wonder why. You got to say to yourself, kind of tells you something's happening here with the air. Something's happening with the air. Okay, one more question, please. Gary?
The water source. Where does the water come from, or where's the proposed water resource once the changes have been made? I mean, if we blocked off all of the intake of water, where's it going to come from to keep the lake?
Excellent question. And the answer is, we don't know yet. I mean, basically, that's one of the curiosities. There are some natural lakes that do drain into it, and it is possible that we could start up with the Imperial Valley again if we could work it out. But interestingly enough, there's no particular plan to build any waterways or anything at this time. I think what they, and again, I could be wrong. I mean, I'm sitting up reading these things at 4 in the morning, trying to make the best sense that I can out of it. But it seems to me that the plan now is fix it, and we'll worry about that later. If I'm wrong and someone out there sees this video and would like to correct me, please feel free to do so. But it's funny you brought that up. That's the one thing that I kind of scratched my head over too, is what would stop it from happening again. And it seems to me like it's only my opinion, okay, but it seems to me the attitude is we'll deal with that when it happens.
So that's what
Why couldn't you use Pacific Ocean water?
Well, you could. I mean, that's one of the things you can do. There's that famous plan to go down to the Sea of Cortez and just drain it out and drain it in.
Well, I don't think you do that, but obviously they're not gonna ever cut loose fresh water for the Salton Sea. I would think at this point, I get it. You can't water the city, you're not gonna water the Salton Sea. So,
No, I agree.
the only water I see that people would cut loose of is ocean water.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason they can't. I mean, there's one of those strange oddities. How many of you know there actually are already waterways that go to the Sea of Cortez? They're already there. Now, we'd have to finish them, but so be it. There already are waterways in existence that go there.
With global warming, rising ocean, we need to drain the ocean, so there's a perfect solution.
There you go,
Exactly. You know, and the funny part is why they, just very quickly, why they focus on the Sea of Cortez though, is because it has a very strange quality to it, which is, you know, the area that you would pull the water up when you get into the Bay Area, it drains out completely every hour. So whatever you put in there goes every hour. It goes out to the open ocean.
Yeah.
So it's not much of a stretch to take the water,
doesn't
put
seem
it out
like
there, an hour later, bring in more water. Kind of amazing, really. Yes?
Fix a program that's targeted to span 75 years. And the target for the lake drying up is only 4 or 5. It seems to me that the destruction of the lake is rapidly outrunning anything that they could do.
I would say that we haven't quite gone to DEFCON 4, but it's awfully close. I mean, there will come a day when it will be too late. Now, for whatever, good, bad, and indifferent, nobody has declared that yet. But people are getting nervous. People at higher levels are getting nervous. Measuring devices for the number of particulates in the air are getting more common. This is becoming a big ticket item. You have to ask yourself why. And the bottom line is our best estimates say that the lake bed will be seabed. Anyways, but it's not a sea. Sorry, it's a lake. Anyways, but the thing is it will be exposed as early as 2017. If it is exposed, the particulates will get into the dust storms. It's a guarantee. It's not man-made. It's not what a man wants to do or not do, or any of those things. It is called the circle of life when you are a dry lake. That's how it works. And so we can either take, we can take action now, or we can take action later, or...
Seems to me later it's not going to work. That 75 years worth of money needs to be put in there now.
I agree. I mean, I think they should have, I mean, in my estimation, again, I'm not an absolute expert in these, times of construction and things like that. But, they're talking about build-up periods of 2 and 3 years. Well, that kind of tells you they need to start like now, by their own projections. Like, really, we've got to have that shovel in that ground by 2015. That's what I'm saying. So we're really coming up on a deadline here. Right, to start to break them out, to start to clean off the one hand, the geothermal plat, on the other side to start to physically clean the sea so that it can return to being a brine sea again with a estuary for the birds that would actually be man-made with a fence. It's very cool, actually.
Just a quick
Yes,
one.
please.
Federal or state? Which one is holding it back?
Hey. Honestly, what I would say is this, again, I would say it's the state. Okay, that's what I see more of the problem, is that, that we do need the federal government, but what we need them for mostly, in my estimation, is for, we need the Army Corps of Engineers. We can't do it by ourselves. If they want to put money into it, I think that would be a fabulous idea. But I would say that so far, most of the self-inflicted wounds have become because of the state and the state entities. It's unfortunately, I don't really want to blame the state too, because the history of it is that the
We can edit that out.
The Salton Authority just haven't really been able to get it together. Jerry Brown came in, he had another group come in, they did nothing, he disbanded it. The original group came in, so a lot of it is our own action, unfortunately. That's, in my mind, the number one cause. Yeah.
Once the water got cut off because San Diego wanted to keep it, did that stop the agricultural fertilizer runoff?
Well, most of it, yeah. I mean,
Oh.
very, very little. I mean, some water still makes it way into the sea, but very,
Uh-huh.
very little. And nowhere near enough to stop what's happening every year. It's just not even close anymore. So.
Another follow-up.
Sure.
The organization in Temecula Everywhere, the Stop the Quarry organization, that had a lot to do with the fear of all those particulates in the air. Maybe that all those thousands of people could get behind, you know, active on this cause.
Yeah, you know, I mean, okay, I'll end it on this because I'm really cutting into everyone's time. Articulate, don't particulate.